And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Hi there. It's time now for your Alaska Marine Weather Outlook. I'm meteorologist Peter Chan coming to you from the National Weather Service on this Thursday, February 20th, 2025. We start out with the ice, and at least as of this Thursday afternoon, we have some polynyas that have opened up in areas along the Chukchi coast, as well as in through Norton Sound. We've had brisk northeast and north winds across this region. Some of those gusting as high as 50 to even near 60 miles an hour, especially out here at the end of the Lisburne Peninsula, including Cape Lisburne and Point Hope. And the ice, certainly there could be some shuffling moving around, polynyas opening and filling and freezing back in. As we get further south off of the Yukon Delta and south of St. Lawrence Island, generally a northeasterly wind will have a tendency to want to push the ice south and a little westward here, even into the weekend, though winds won't be quite as strong as what they were the past day or so. Looking at the weather map for late tonight into early Friday morning, most of the action is going to be out here in the Gulf. No really especially deep lows with really strong winds or really heavy precipitation, but enough to keep active weather going along the Gulf Coast and Panhandle. Back to the west, there is a low with north, just up on the north side there of the western Aleutians, but most of the action coming up here to close out the week and start the weekend will be here along the Gulf Coast. Another low will be lifting up toward the lower portion of the Gulf on Friday, pushing another front up toward the southern western areas of the Panhandle. That'll bring some more rain and gusty winds. Meanwhile, back to the west, we have another low that'll be coming from around south of Kodiak Island across the Alaska Peninsula tonight into Friday. And that one low that was out there in the southwest Bering, just kind of sitting out and just north of the western Aleutians. And then by Saturday, we kind of have a collection of lows, 980 low here, the center with a couple of weaker lows either side. And these are just going to have impulses of moisture and some gusty winds as they rotate through areas of the Panhandle and Gulf Coast through the course of this weekend. So the marine forecast for the Panhandle, inner channels, northeast winds 15 knots, Lynn Canal, Stevens Passage, waves 2-3 feet. Dixon Entrance, though, especially there, just southwest of Craig, we could be looking at gale force winds of 40 knots with gusts to 55 knots there. So that's where the most significant wind and wave action will be, with waves as high as 15 to near 20 feet. As we go northward, we're generally looking at easterly winds, 25 to 30 knots south of Sitka, and generally around 25 knots outside the icy strait and off of Yakutat Bay, with waves 14 feet or so there. On Saturday, we'll still have some gale force winds there off of Craig, off the Prince of Wales Island. Southeast winds 35 knots for Stevens Passage and Lynn Canal, northeast winds 15 knots, waves continuing around a couple of feet. And as we round up from Sitka off of Yakutat Bay and Cape Suckling, 25 to maybe 30 knots out of the icy strait with waves 11 to 13 feet. For the northwestern Gulf, southeast winds of 25 knots within Prince William Sound and outside of Hinchinbrook Entrance, waves 6 feet Prince William Sound, upwards of 14, 15 feet in this area of the Gulf. As we go down the length of Cook Inlet, look for northeast winds 25 to 30 knots with waves as high as 7 to 9 feet, lower Cook Inlet, Kamishak Bay. And then on Saturday, winds will not be as strong. Northeast winds, upper Cook Inlet, Prince William Sound, waves a few feet at best. And then as we drop on down through middle, lower Cook Inlet, north to northeast winds at 20 knots, waves 4 to 6 feet. And then outside of Hinchinbrook Entrance and off the Kenai coast, northeast winds at 20 knots with waves of 8 to 9 feet. On Friday, across Kodiak Island, east-northeast winds 25 knots, waves 7 feet within Shelikof Strait, 11 feet offshore there of the island. And then as we drop on down along the Alaska Peninsula, northeast winds will become variable, only around 10 knots because we have that area of low pressure, the center, coming across the lower half of the peninsula. So we're looking at waves around 6 feet on the North Pacific side and 2 to 3 feet on the Bering side. For Saturday, across much of the region, variable winds only around 10 knots, and that'll be the case from Kodiak Island all the way down the Alaska Peninsula, except for becoming more westerly 15 knots either side there at Cold Bay and False Pass. For the Aleutians, light winds generally the rule, especially central Aleutians on Friday. Northeasterly winds far eastern Aleutians around Unalaska at 15 knots. Variable winds only around 10 knots. Central Aleutians. And then as we get back out toward that lingering area of low pressure here just east of Shimia, kind of winds in the 15 to 20 knot range, but not especially strong. And then on Saturday, generally west winds at 15 knots across the eastern Aleutians from Unalaska to Nikolsky. As we get through Atka and Adak to Kiska, southwest winds around 20 knots. And then west of Kiska to Shimia, look for northwest to west winds at 20 knots. Along the southwest coast, 20-knot winds out of the northeast, out of Bristol Bay, north winds out of Kuskokwim Bay at 15 knots, just variable winds around 10 knots at the Pribilovs. And then northeast winds out of Norton Sound along the lower Yukon Delta at 20 knots. So again, that's what's going to have a tendency to want to still push that ice a bit southward. And then on Saturday, winds a bit lighter, easterly 10 knots within Bristol Bay. Still variable, only around 10 knots there. The Pribilovs with waves a few feet. And then from Kuskokwim Bay up along the Yukon Delta and into Norton Sound, generally north winds at 15 knots. And looking at the far north, starting with the Bering Strait, St. Lawrence Island, northeast to north winds 25 to 30 knots. Though locally, we could have 35-knot gales off of Cape Lisburne. And then as we round up along the Chukchi Sea coast into the Beaufort Sea, northeast winds 20 to as high as 30 knots as you get toward Kaktovik. And on Saturday, then we expect winds to continue east-northeasterly around 20 to 25 knots from Kaktovik through off of Wainwright. But again, locally 35 knots off of Cape Lisburne, Point Hope areas, and then dropping down through the Bering Strait, we're looking at north winds of 20 to 25 knots, especially there on the north side of St. Lawrence Island.